My name is Maya Lawson, I'm 34 years old, and the night my ex-husband showed up begging my son to call him Dad. Another man walked through the door and destroyed him without even trying. Rain slammed hard against my apartment windows in Detroit while Nathaniel Brooks sat across from me looking completely broken. The same wealthy man who once stayed silent while his mother humiliated me in front of an entire ballroom was now staring at family photos hanging on my wall with tears in his eyes. Photos of birthdays, science trophies, school graduations. A whole life he abandoned. Then he finally looked at my son and whispered, "Liam, I'm your father." The room went silent. But before my son could answer, the front door opened. And the second Liam saw Marcus walking inside carrying grocery bags, his face lit up instantly. "There you are," he shouted before running straight into his arms. And honestly, the look on Nathaniel's face in that moment is something I'll never forget. Welcome to her revenge stories. Before I tell you how a poor waitress became the woman they later begged for forgiveness, please like, subscribe, and comment what time you're watching from. I grew up in a struggling neighborhood in Detroit with my parents and younger brother, Tyler. And honestly, life was already difficult long before I understood what poverty really meant. My mother, Angela Lawson, worked exhausting shifts as a diner waitress almost every day of her life. Some mornings she left home before sunrise carrying an old faded purse and wearing shoes that hurt her feet so badly she limped by nighttime. Most evenings she returned smelling like burnt coffee, cooking grease, and cigarette smoke from customers who barely looked at her while demanding refills. But the person who changed our entire family's life forever was my father. I was 13 years old when the accident happened. That morning, my father Harold kissed my forehead before leaving for work at a construction site downtown. I still remember him joking with Tyler near the front door while promising to bring burgers home after work. That night, strangers carried him back into our apartment unable to move his legs. A scaffold had collapsed several floors above him. The injury damaged his spine permanently. And honestly, our family never truly recovered after that day. My father spent most of his time sitting quietly beside the living room window in an old wheelchair that squeaked loudly anytime it moved. Sometimes I caught him staring outside at people walking freely down the street while his eyes slowly filled with tears he tried hiding from us. Those moments broke me the most. There were nights our electricity almost got disconnected. Nights my mother pretended she already ate dinner so Tyler and I could have enough food. Sometimes I woke up after midnight and found her quietly crying over unpaid bills spread across the kitchen table. But despite everything, my parents raised us with love. And I tried my best to make life easier for them. I graduated near the top of my secondary school class and dreamed of becoming a nurse because caring for people came naturally to me. Whenever my father's pain became severe during the night, I stayed awake helping him sit comfortably or reminding him to take medication. One night he smiled at me sadly and whispered, "You were born with healing hands, Maya." That sentence stayed with me for years. But dreams and poverty rarely cooperate. After graduation, college became impossible financially. We barely survived month to month already. So instead of continuing school, I immediately started working at an upscale restaurant called the Grand Willow Lounge where wealthy businessmen, politicians, and socialites spent more money on dinner than my family sometimes spent in 2 months. And honestly, working there felt like living inside another world. Crystal chandeliers, expensive perfume, people laughing loudly while waitresses silently rushed around pretending not to feel exhausted. That was where I met Nathaniel Brooks. The first time I saw him, I immediately knew he came from money. Everything about him looked expensive without him even trying. The watch, the tailored suit, the confidence. But unlike most wealthy customers, Nathaniel actually looked people in the eyes while speaking to them. And strangely enough, that small detail stood out to me immediately. The night we properly met, the restaurant was overcrowded because of a political fundraising event. We were severely understaffed, so my mother came to help temporarily during the rush. At one point, she accidentally slipped slightly while carrying several heavy plates near Nathaniel's table. My heart nearly stopped. I rushed forward quickly and grabbed the trays before everything crashed onto the floor. The entire restaurant froze for a second. My mother looked terrified. Managers at places like that fired workers over embarrassing scenes. But Nathaniel immediately stood up asking if she was okay before anyone else even reacted. That surprised me. Most rich customers noticed workers only when something went wrong. Later that evening, while I cleaned tables near closing time, Nathaniel stopped me gently. "Is your mom all right?" he asked sincerely. I remember staring at him for a second because the concern in his voice sounded real. Not fake politeness. Real concern. And honestly, that small moment changed everything. After that night, Nathaniel started visiting the restaurant more often. At first, I convinced myself it was coincidence. Then eventually, I realized he was coming to see me. And honestly, that terrified me more than it excited me. Because men like Nathaniel Brooks did not belong in my world. And deep down, I already knew people from worlds like his rarely stayed long in worlds like mine. The more Nathaniel Brooks visited the restaurant, the harder it became pretending there wasn't something growing between us. At first, it was small things. He stayed longer after dinner just to talk while I cleaned tables. Sometimes he waited outside until my shift ended so he could walk me home safely through the cold Detroit streets. Other times he brought coffee for my mother during exhausting late-night shifts and somehow remembered exactly how she liked it: 2 sugars, extra cream. And honestly, those little details mattered to me more than expensive gifts ever could. Because people from wealthy backgrounds usually treated workers like furniture. Present, but invisible. Nathaniel didn't. One rainy evening after work, I found him sitting quietly inside his car waiting for me with takeout containers balanced beside him. "You haven't eaten properly today, have you?" he asked casually. I stared at him suspiciously. "How do you know that?" He laughed softly. "Because you've been serving everyone else for 6 hours and never once sat down." That moment stayed with me longer than it probably should have. Then eventually, he started visiting my family too. And honestly, that confused me more than anything else. Most wealthy people avoided discomfort. Avoided poverty. Avoided places that reminded them life wasn't perfect. But Nathaniel walked directly into our tiny apartment like none of it embarrassed him. I still remember the first evening he visited properly. The heater barely worked. Rainwater stains spread across part of the ceiling. My father's wheelchair squeaked loudly anytime he moved. And my mother kept apologizing nervously every 5 minutes for things we couldn't afford to fix. "The apartment usually looks better than this," she lied awkwardly while hiding cracked dishes behind the sink. Tyler barely spoke during dinner because embarrassment had already made him quiet around rich people. But Nathaniel never acted uncomfortable. Not once. Instead, he sat beside my father for almost 2 hours talking about sports, construction jobs, and old music from the 70s while my father laughed harder than I had heard in months. And honestly, that broke me emotionally in ways I can't fully explain. Because illness and poverty slowly steal people's dignity. But Nathaniel somehow made my father feel human again instead of pitted. Later that night, while walking him downstairs after dinner, I finally tried warning him again. "You really don't understand the kind of life I come from," I told him quietly while heavy rain hit the apartment windows above us. Nathaniel looked at me for several seconds before smiling softly. "Maya. We're all people at the end of the day." Simple words. But nobody from his world had ever spoken to me like that before. And slowly, I started falling in love with him. Not because he had money. Honestly, money scared me more than it impressed me. I fell for him because he made me feel seen, valued, safe. For the first time in my life, somebody looked at me like my background didn't determine my worth. Then one night before leaving our apartment, Nathaniel looked directly at me and quietly said something that changed everything. One day, he promised softly, "I'm going to help you become a nurse." I actually cried after he left. Not loudly. Just quietly in the bathroom where nobody could hear me. Because nobody had ever treated my dreams like they mattered before. Soon afterward, Nathaniel started helping Tyler return to school properly after he almost dropped out to work construction jobs. Then he rented a slightly better apartment for my family so my father could move around more comfortably in his wheelchair. For the first time in years, hope entered our home again. My mother smiled more. Tyler became excited about life again. Even my father started talking about the future sometimes. But despite all that, my parents still worried constantly. One night while folding laundry, my mother suddenly looked at me seriously and said, "Rich families don't usually accept girls like us for long." I immediately defended Nathaniel. Every single time. Because during those early months, he truly loved me. At least I believed he did. And honestly, looking back now, I think part of him really did. That's what made everything hurt so much later. Eventually, Nathaniel introduced me to his mother, Victoria Brooks. And honestly, the moment I stepped inside their mansion in Chicago, I immediately felt like somebody who accidentally entered a place she did not belong. Everything inside looked perfect. Not normal perfect. Untouchable perfect. The chandelier above the entrance alone probably cost more than my parents made in years. The walls carried expensive paintings I was afraid to stand too close to. Even the air inside smelled expensive somehow. Quiet piano music played softly from hidden speakers while workers moved around the house almost silently. I remember staring at my shoes nervously before entering because I was terrified of dirtying the cream-colored carpet near the stairs. At first, Victoria Brooks treated me politely. Very politely. Too politely. She smiled warmly when Nathaniel introduced me. Complimented my appearance. Asked calm questions about work and family. And honestly, for a brief moment, I thought maybe my mother had been wrong about rich families. But then Victoria casually asked where I grew up. And everything changed. Not dramatically. Subtly. That was the frightening part. The warmth inside her eyes slowly disappeared while I explained my background. The smile remained on her face, but it no longer reached her eyes the same way. When I mentioned my father being paralyzed from a construction accident, she paused for half a second before lifting her wine glass quietly. And somehow, I felt embarrassed for simply existing. Later that night, while Nathaniel walked me toward the guest bathroom, I accidentally overheard Victoria speaking softly inside another room. "You're successful enough to marry someone from your own world," she told him calmly. I froze immediately. Nathaniel defended me right away. "She's kind, intelligent, hardworking." But Victoria interrupted gently. "That's not what I mean." The silence afterward made my stomach hurt. Still, Nathaniel continued seeing me seriously, and eventually Victoria accepted the relationship outwardly. At least publicly. But honestly, I don't think she ever truly accepted me internally. Our wedding months later looked beautiful from the outside. Expensive flowers. Elegant music. Perfect lighting. But beneath all that beauty, there were moments of quiet humiliation I'll never forget. I still remember my mother nervously adjusting the sleeves of her old dress before entering the reception hall because she worried wealthy guests would judge her appearance. And sadly, they did. People whispered. Some stared too long at my parents. At one point during dinner, I overheard a woman quietly asking another guest, Which side is the waitress mother from? The other woman tried hiding her laugh behind a champagne glass. I pretended not to hear it. But my chest hurt the rest of the night. Nathaniel noticed my silence later and pulled me onto the dance floor gently. "You okay?" he whispered. I nodded even though I wasn't. Because honestly, I didn't want to ruin the happiest night of our lives. And during those early weeks of marriage, things truly felt beautiful sometimes. Nathaniel defended me during awkward conversations. He kissed my forehead every morning before work. Some nights we stayed awake cooking terrible pasta together while laughing in the kitchen at midnight like teenagers pretending to be adults. Other times we drove around Chicago for hours talking about future plans. Children. Travel. School. Life. And for the first time in years, I felt safe enough to dream again. Then my father's health suddenly became worse. Years of complications from the accident slowly destroyed his body. I remember getting the phone call while grocery shopping with Nathaniel. My mother could barely speak through tears. By the time we reached Detroit, my father was gone. Honestly, losing him broke something inside me permanently. At the funeral, I collapsed beside the grave crying so hard I could barely breathe properly. Nathaniel held me tightly the entire time while rain soaked through our black clothes. And that night, while lying against his chest unable to sleep, I genuinely believed our love could survive anything. I had no idea things were already beginning to change quietly behind my back. Little things at first. Cold glances. Subtle comments. Moments that seemed harmless individually. But looking back now, that was the beginning of everything falling apart. One afternoon, Victoria invited several wealthy friends over for lunch at the mansion. And honestly, I already felt nervous the moment I saw the cars pulling into the driveway. Women stepped out wearing designer coats and expensive jewelry that probably cost more than my parents' entire apartment furniture. Their laughter filled the house before they even walked inside. Meanwhile, I stood in the kitchen helping staff arrange plates while trying not to feel out of place inside my own home. At some point, Victoria called me into the dining room carrying a tray of tea and desserts. I remember my hands shaking slightly while placing cups carefully onto the table because those women looked at me the same way people inspect something they don't fully approve of. One of them finally smiled at me politely and asked, "So Maya, what do your parents do?" The table became strangely quiet afterward. I answered respectfully but briefly. My mother worked as a waitress for years. My father was injured during construction work. The woman exchanged a glance with Victoria before laughing softly into her wine glass. "Victoria," she said carefully, "you really allowed your son to settle beneath his level." My entire body immediately went cold. Victoria forced a small uncomfortable smile. "Well," she replied lightly, "Nathaniel insisted." And honestly, that sentence hurt more than open insults. Because suddenly I understood something painful. She wasn't embarrassed privately. She was embarrassed publicly. The atmosphere became awkward immediately after that. One woman changed the subject quickly while another avoided eye contact completely. I quietly excused myself and returned to the kitchen pretending I needed to check something in the oven. But the second the door closed behind me, I leaned against the counter trying not to cry. And from that afternoon forward, things inside the house slowly began changing. At first, the comments were subtle enough to almost ignore. Victoria corrected my table manners publicly during dinners. Not aggressively. Softly. Which honestly made it worse. "Fork in the left hand, Maya." Or, in formal settings, people usually wait before sitting. Little comments. Tiny embarrassments. Constant reminders that I did not naturally belong there. Then during Christmas shopping, Victoria bought expensive gifts for nearly everyone in the family. Designer watches, luxury handbags, jewelry. When she finally handed me my gift, it was a generic perfume set from a department store clearance rack. And honestly, I hated myself for noticing. But humiliation becomes impossible to ignore when it happens repeatedly. Sometimes she made comments while pretending not to insult me directly. Refinement usually starts during childhood. Or, money can improve appearance, but not upbringing. Nathaniel still defended me during those early moments. At least partially. But I slowly noticed something changing in him too. Exhaustion. Avoidance. Sometimes when his mother made uncomfortable comments, he no longer argued immediately. Instead, he stayed quiet longer. And silence can become louder than insults after a while. The real conflict started when I finally prepared to enroll in part-time nursing college. That dream had carried me through years of struggle. And Nathaniel had promised long ago that once life settled down, he would help me continue school. So when I finally held the application papers in my hands, I honestly felt hopeful again for the first time in months. Until Victoria discovered it. She immediately shut the conversation down during dinner. "No," she said coldly. Nathaniel looked genuinely confused. "What do you mean no?" Victoria calmly placed down her fork. She survived perfectly fine without college before. Serving tables suited her well enough. I felt my chest tighten instantly. Nathaniel argued with her that night. I heard raised voices from the study while standing silently upstairs near the hallway. For a moment, I thought he would finally choose me completely. But slowly. Even his confidence started weakening beneath his mother's pressure. And honestly, that scared me more than Victoria herself ever did. Because strangers rejecting you hurts. But the person you love slowly pulling away. That destroys something deeper. Then one night, while walking downstairs for water, I overheard Victoria speaking privately with Nathaniel inside the living room. "She will never truly belong here," she whispered firmly. Then she started naming wealthy women from respected families he could have married instead. Women with status, education, connections. And for the first time, Nathaniel didn't defend me immediately. The silence that followed felt unbearable. I stood frozen halfway down the stairs, gripping the railing so tightly my fingers hurt. And honestly, that silence terrified me more than every insult his mother had ever thrown at me. Everything finally exploded during a massive company dinner party hosted by the Brooks family. And honestly, I knew something was wrong the moment we arrived. The ballroom inside the luxury hotel glowed with crystal lights and expensive decorations while wealthy executives laughed loudly beside tables covered in champagne glasses and silver centerpieces. Women in glittering dresses moved confidently through the crowd while photographers snapped pictures near the entrance. Meanwhile, I stood beside Nathaniel feeling strangely invisible despite everyone staring at me. Victoria spent the entire evening introducing business partners to other women while barely acknowledging me properly. At one point, she introduced me to a couple by simply saying, "This is Nathaniel's wife." Not even my name. Just a title. And somehow, that hurt. Still, I kept smiling politely because embarrassing wealthy families publicly was apparently considered worse than humiliating someone privately. The tension inside me kept growing throughout the night though. Little moments. Cold glances. Quiet whispers. People looking at me too long before suddenly changing conversations once I approached. Then the moment happened. The moment that destroyed everything. One older businessman complimented my appearance while we stood near the ballroom staircase. "You look very elegant tonight," he told me kindly. Before I could even respond, Victoria laughed softly beside him while sipping champagne. "Money can buy beautiful dresses," she said lightly, but not class. The entire conversation immediately died. I remember hearing silverware stop clinking against plates nearby. The businessman looked uncomfortable instantly. But Victoria continued calmly like she hadn't just insulted me in front of dozens of people. Some people grow up learning refinement, she added coldly. Others spend their lives trying to imitate it. Then she looked directly at me before delivering the sentence that shattered me completely. After all, she's still the daughter of a poor paralyzed laborer. The room became painfully silent. And honestly, I cannot fully explain what humiliation feels like until you've experienced wealthy people quietly staring at you with pity while pretending not to. My entire body froze. I could feel heat rushing into my face while my chest tightened so badly I struggled breathing normally. Some guests looked away awkwardly. Others pretended to sip drinks while secretly watching the scene unfold. And slowly, I turned toward Nathaniel. Desperately. Because deep down, I still believed he loved me enough to protect me. I waited for him to speak. To defend me. To say something. Anything. But he stayed silent. Completely silent. And honestly, something inside me broke permanently in that moment. Not because of Victoria. I expected cruelty from her already. But Nathaniel's silence felt like abandonment happening in real time. I remember forcing myself not to cry publicly while quietly excusing myself from the ballroom. My heels clicked loudly against the marble hallway floor as I rushed toward the restroom, trying desperately to hold myself together. Inside the bathroom, I locked myself inside a stall and finally broke down completely. Not loud crying. The dangerous kind. Silent crying where your whole body shakes while you cover your mouth so nobody hears you falling apart. And the worst part. A small voice inside my head kept repeating my mother's warning. Rich families don't usually accept girls like us for long. Later that night after the party ended, I overheard Victoria speaking privately with Nathaniel inside his study. The door wasn't fully closed. "She does not belong here," Victoria whispered sharply. And this time, Nathaniel didn't defend me. Instead, after several painful seconds of silence, he quietly answered. "Maybe I made a mistake." I stopped breathing for a second. The hallway suddenly felt too small. Too quiet. Too cold. And honestly, I didn't fully understand those words yet. Not completely. Until everything began collapsing afterward. Because after that night, Nathaniel slowly started becoming someone I barely recognized. And the man who once promised to protect me began helping his mother destroy me instead. Within weeks after that dinner party, Nathaniel changed completely. Not suddenly. That would have been easier to understand. It happened slowly. Like watching a door quietly close little by little until one day you realize you're standing outside alone. He stopped taking me to business events. Stopped asking about nursing school. Stopped noticing when I cried. Sometimes he came home late and barely spoke during dinner. Other nights he locked himself inside his office pretending to work while I sat alone upstairs wondering how the same man who once held my hand through grief could suddenly feel so emotionally distant. And honestly, the silence inside that mansion became unbearable. The worst part was watching him slowly become embarrassed by me. One afternoon I overheard him introducing me to someone over the phone. Not proudly. Almost carefully. Like he needed to soften my existence before people judged him for it. That broke me more than I expected. Then things became worse financially too. Nathaniel quietly stopped paying Tyler's school support. My brother called me one evening trying to sound calm, but I could hear panic in his voice. "Maya. Classes are about to drop me from the program." I sat frozen on the edge of the bed staring at the floor while guilt slowly crushed me. Then came the moment I realized my marriage was truly ending. Our family apartment lease in Detroit was about to expire, so one evening during dinner I carefully reminded Nathaniel about it. I wasn't demanding anything. I was nervous even asking. But he looked at me coldly and said, "Maybe your family should go back to where they really belong." Honestly, I felt something inside my chest physically ache after hearing that sentence. Because suddenly I realized something devastating. The woman who once insulted me publicly had finally succeeded in changing the man I loved. 5 months after our wedding, Victoria officially pressured Nathaniel into divorcing me. And the terrifying part? He agreed. No screaming. No dramatic fight. Just papers. Silence. Cold signatures across a conference table while lawyers avoided eye contact. I remember walking out of that office feeling numb. Completely numb. Like my entire life had collapsed too quickly for my emotions to catch up properly. After the divorce, my mother and I rented a tiny apartment on the edge of Detroit beside an old laundromat that stayed noisy almost all night. The walls were thin. The heater barely worked. And honestly, some nights I cried quietly into my pillow wondering how life had changed so brutally in less than a year. Then a few weeks later, I discovered I was pregnant. I panicked completely. The bathroom test slipped from my hands onto the sink while my entire body shook. At first, fear overwhelmed me so badly I actually considered ending the pregnancy. Not because I didn't want my baby, but because I couldn't imagine bringing a child into a life already drowning in struggle. I had no husband. No stability. No money. And honestly, I was terrified. But eventually, after long nights of crying and praying beside my mother in our tiny kitchen, I chose to keep my baby. And looking back now, that decision saved my life emotionally. Because the moment I heard my son's heartbeat for the first time, something inside me changed permanently. I stopped surviving only for myself. I started fighting for him. I worked everywhere possible. Morning waitress shifts. Night cleaning jobs inside office buildings. Studying nursing textbooks beside baby bottles and overdue bills. Sometimes I fell asleep at library tables from exhaustion while trying desperately to finish assignments before daycare closed. There were nights I skipped meals so my son could eat properly. Winters where I wrapped Liam in extra blankets because our heater barely functioned. Moments I sat in parking lots crying quietly before work because I genuinely didn't know how much longer I could physically keep going. But then Liam would smile at me with those bright innocent eyes and somehow give me strength again. One evening while I studied anatomy flashcards beside the couch, he climbed onto my lap holding one of my nursing books upside down. "Mommy," he said proudly, "you're gonna be the best nurse ever." And honestly, that tiny moment healed parts of me nobody else could. Years passed. And honestly, there were moments during those years when I genuinely thought life would never get easier. But somehow, little by little, it did. Not magically. Not overnight. Just slowly. Painfully. One exhausted step at a time. I finally completed nursing school after years of balancing work, motherhood, and survival all at once. The day I graduated, my hands shook while holding the certificate because part of me still remembered the poor waitress who thought her dream had died years earlier. My mother cried harder than I did during the ceremony. And Liam? He screamed louder than everybody when they called my name. "That's my mom," he shouted proudly from the audience while standing on his chair. Honestly, people around us started laughing and clapping because his excitement was impossible not to love. Eventually, I started working at one of the largest hospitals in Detroit and slowly earned respect as a senior nurse. But my greatest achievement was never my career. It was Liam. That boy became brilliant in ways that constantly shocked people. By age 10, he was solving math problems high school students struggled with. At 13, teachers started recommending national academic programs. At 15, colleges were already contacting him early. But despite how intelligent he became, Liam stayed humble. Kind. Gentle. And honestly. Every time I looked at him, I silently thanked God for convincing me not to give up all those years earlier. Then came the competition that changed everything. A nationally televised academic championship featuring the brightest students across America. The event was huge. Corporate sponsors. News coverage. Live audience. Millions watching from home. I remember sitting inside the auditorium that night barely breathing properly while cameras moved across the crowd and bright lights flashed everywhere. Liam sat confidently with the finalists on stage wearing a navy blue suit Marcus helped him pick days earlier. And honestly, seeing my son sitting there under those lights felt surreal. Because all I could think about was the tiny apartment beside the laundromat. The overdue bills. The nights we survived on noodles and canned soup. And now somehow, my son stood on national television representing excellence across the country. Meanwhile, several states away in Chicago, Nathaniel and Victoria happened to be watching the competition during dinner. At first, they simply admired Liam like everyone else watching. Victoria even smiled at one point saying, "That young man is incredibly intelligent." Nathaniel nodded quietly. "He carries himself well too." Neither of them had any idea they were watching their own blood. Back inside the auditorium, the competition became intense. Final question. Final round. The room felt electric. I remember gripping my purse so tightly my fingers hurt while Liam stood calmly beside the buzzer. Then the final question appeared. And within seconds, Liam answered correctly. The entire auditorium exploded into applause. People jumped to their feet cheering while cameras rushed toward the stage. I burst into tears immediately. Real tears. The uncontrollable kind. Meanwhile, Liam stood there stunned while confetti slowly fell around him. And honestly, that moment healed years of pain inside me. Then the host smiled toward the audience and said, "And now, we'd love to welcome the parent behind this incredible young man onto the stage." I froze instantly. Liam turned toward me smiling emotionally. "Mom!" he shouted into the microphone. The audience applauded louder while cameras suddenly pointed directly at me. My legs actually felt weak walking toward that stage. Meanwhile, back in Chicago, Nathaniel casually lifted his wine glass while watching television. Then the host announced, "Please welcome senior nurse Maya Lawson." The glass slipped from Nathaniel's hand immediately. Victoria turned toward the television so quickly her chair nearly moved backward. And then they saw me. Walking onto the stage beside Liam. Alive. Successful. Confident. Not broken. At first, they genuinely convinced themselves it had to be coincidence. Another Maya Lawson. Another woman. Another child. Because according to the version of life they created in their heads, I was supposed to fail. Supposed to disappear quietly after the divorce. Supposed to remain the poor waitress they once pitied. But then the camera zoomed closer. And reality hit them all at once. I stood beside Liam emotionally while the audience continued clapping around us. The host smiled warmly and asked, "So Maya, how does it feel raising a son like this?" I looked toward Liam before answering. And honestly, my voice shook slightly. "It wasn't easy," I admitted softly. "There were nights we barely had enough. Nights I studied beside baby bottles while working cleaning jobs just trying to survive. But my son gave me purpose during the hardest years of my life." The entire auditorium became silent listening. Then I smiled proudly at Liam. And somehow, this beautiful boy became the reason I refused to give up. People started applauding again. Some audience members wiped tears from their eyes. And somewhere far away in Chicago, Nathaniel and Victoria sat frozen in complete shock, realizing something devastating. The child they abandoned years earlier was now standing on national television, making the entire country proud. And the woman they once treated like she was worthless had become extraordinary without them. A few weeks after the competition aired nationally, Nathaniel and Victoria finally found the hospital where I worked. Honestly, part of me always knew they eventually would. People like the Brooks family were used to finding whatever they wanted. But I still wasn't emotionally prepared for the moment it finally happened. That afternoon had already been exhausting. The emergency wing was overcrowded, one patient's family kept arguing loudly near the hallway, and I had barely eaten anything since morning. So when another nurse handed me a consultation file and casually said, "Your next appointment is waiting in office 3. I walked toward the room without thinking much about it. Then I opened the door and froze instantly. Nathaniel and Victoria were sitting there. For a second, I genuinely forgot how to breathe. Victoria looked older. Not dramatically. Just heavier emotionally somehow. The elegant, confident woman who once humiliated me publicly now looked nervous, sitting in a hospital chair, twisting tissues between trembling fingers. Nathaniel stood up immediately the moment he saw me. "Maya." His voice cracked before he could finish. And honestly, painful memories hit me so fast all at once that my chest physically hurt. The ballroom humiliation. The divorce papers. My mother crying quietly after we lost the apartment. Pregnant nights alone beside library textbooks. Everything came rushing back so suddenly I had to grip the door slightly to steady myself. Victoria burst into tears almost immediately. Real tears. Not dramatic performance tears. The kind older people cry when regret has been eating them alive for years. "I'm so sorry," she whispered repeatedly while covering her mouth. Nathaniel looked completely broken standing there. For a moment, nobody moved. The silence inside the office felt unbearable. Then Nathaniel finally spoke again. "We saw the competition," he said quietly. "Maya. I didn't know." I almost laughed hearing that. Not because it was funny, but because after everything that happened, those words sounded painfully meaningless. Didn't know what? That I survived. That I mattered. That abandoning people has consequences. Nathaniel kept apologizing over and over. He admitted he regretted the divorce almost immediately afterward. Admitted the woman he later married eventually left him too. Admitted he spent years trying unsuccessfully to forget me. Then finally, he admitted something that honestly shocked me. "I was weak," he whispered while staring at the floor. "I let my mother destroy the best thing that ever happened to me." Victoria immediately started crying harder beside him. And honestly, listening to them felt strange after all those years. Because the same people now sitting in front of me begging for forgiveness once made me feel ashamed for simply existing. The same woman crying into tissues now once looked at me publicly and called me beneath their class. The same man apologizing emotionally now once stayed silent while I got humiliated in front of an entire ballroom. And suddenly, I realized something painful. Time changes regret. But it doesn't erase damage. Nathaniel eventually asked the question I knew was coming. "Does Liam know about me?" The room became quiet again. I looked toward the window for a second before answering softly. "He knows enough." Nathaniel's eyes immediately filled with tears. And for the first time since entering that room, part of me almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then another memory flashed inside my head. The night he told me maybe my family should go back where they belong. And whatever sympathy tried entering my heart disappeared again. Eventually, I quietly placed the consultation file onto the desk. "I have patients waiting," I said calmly. Victoria suddenly reached toward me emotionally. "Please, Maya." But honestly, I couldn't stay inside that room another second. So I walked out without saying anything else. My hands shook the entire way down the hallway afterward. And strangely enough, I cried inside the supply room 10 minutes later. Not because I wanted them back. Not because I missed them. But because seeing them again reopened wounds I spent years teaching myself how to survive. And apparently, they still weren't ready to let go yet. Several weeks later, Nathaniel and Victoria arrived unexpectedly at my apartment. Honestly, the moment I opened the door and saw them standing there, my stomach immediately tightened. It was early evening in Detroit. Rain tapped softly against the windows while the smell of soup filled the apartment from the kitchen. Liam sat nearby finishing homework at the table, completely unaware his entire past was standing outside our front door. Victoria looked exhausted emotionally. Not physically. Emotionally. Like regret had slowly aged her from the inside. Nathaniel looked even worse. His eyes immediately moved around the apartment quietly, taking in family photos hanging on the walls. Photos of birthdays. School awards. Nursing graduation pictures. Memories they were never part of. And honestly, the silence inside that room became uncomfortable almost immediately. Victoria started crying first. "Maya. Please," she whispered shakily. "We know we don't deserve forgiveness. But please don't keep Liam away from us." Nathaniel looked toward me with tears sitting heavily in his eyes. "I was a coward," he admitted softly. "I let people influence me when I should have protected you." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then finally Nathaniel slowly turned toward Liam. My son looked confused, sitting there holding a pencil in one hand while trying to understand why grown adults suddenly looked emotional around him. And then Nathaniel quietly said the words I feared for years. "Liam. I'm your father." The room became painfully silent. Honestly, my heart started beating so loudly I could hear it inside my ears. Liam stared at him speechlessly. Victoria covered her mouth, crying harder. Nathaniel looked hopeful and terrified at the same time. Then suddenly, the front door opened behind them. Marcus Reed walked inside carrying grocery bags while shaking rainwater from his jacket. "Man, this weather is getting crazier every." He stopped talking the second he noticed strangers inside the apartment. But before anybody could explain anything, Liam's entire face lit up instantly. "There you are," he shouted happily before jumping up and running straight toward him. Marcus barely had time to lower the grocery bags before Liam hugged him tightly. And honestly, that single moment said everything. Nobody planned it. Nobody forced it. It happened naturally. Because love built through consistency always reveals itself honestly. Marcus laughed softly while hugging Liam back. "Hey buddy," he smiled. "Did you finish your science project?" Liam immediately started talking excitedly while pulling him toward the kitchen like that moment earlier never even happened. Meanwhile Nathaniel stood frozen near the doorway watching another man receive the trust, comfort, and love he abandoned years earlier. Not because Marcus was richer. Not because Marcus tried replacing him. But because Marcus stayed. Quietly. Patiently. Lovingly. During the hard years. The invisible years. The years when nobody else wanted us. And for the first time in a very long time, Victoria finally lowered her head completely in shame. Because deep down, both of them finally understood something painful. Biology can create a child. But sacrifice creates family. Before leaving, Nathaniel looked toward me one final time. And honestly, I saw regret inside his eyes so deep it almost looked physical. But some damage arrives too late for repair. After they left, Liam quietly asked me, "Mom, was he really my father?" I looked at Marcus helping unpack groceries inside the kitchen before answering softly, "Yes. Biologically." Liam stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then he simply nodded and said, "Okay. But Marcus is the one who stayed." And honestly, there was nothing else left to say after that. So tell me, do you believe people truly change after destroying someone's life? Or are some apologies simply too late? I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this story touched you emotionally, please subscribe to her revenge stories and share this video with someone who needs to hear it tonight.